The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile conference room of Harrison and Associates, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany table where 12 department heads sat in uncomfortable silence. Outside, Chicago's November wind rattled the 42nd floor windows, matching the tension that had been building in this room for the past 3 months. My name is Sarah Chun, and I've been the senior financial auditor at this prestigious consulting firm for 7 years. What happened that Tuesday morning would change everything I thought I knew about corporate politics, family dynamics, and the dangerous game of power that plays out in boardrooms across America. It started like any other quarterly review meeting, but the air felt different this time. Heavier, more charged. I clutched my leather portfolio containing what I knew was the most comprehensive and damning audit report I'd ever compiled. 3 months of meticulous investigation, late nights poring over spreadsheets, and discreet conversations with concerned employees had led to this moment. Please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue to share these authentic experiences that happen in workplaces around the world. Marcus Harrison, the company's founding partner, sat at the head of the table with his usual commanding presence. At 62, he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from nothing. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Armani suit pressed to perfection, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed the room with the sharpness of a hawk. But today, something seemed off about him. There was a weariness in his shoulders, a slight tremor in his hands that I'd never noticed before. To his right sat his adopted son, David Harrison, the newly appointed vice president of operations. At 28, David had been fast-tracked through various positions in the company, climbing the corporate ladder at a pace that left many of us questioning whether merit or nepotism was driving his ascent. He wore a navy blue suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his blonde hair slicked back with expensive pomade, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The contrast between father and son was striking, not just in appearance but in temperament. Where Marcus was methodical and thoughtful, David was impulsive and dismissive. Where Marcus listened carefully to advice, David seemed to believe his own opinion was the only one that mattered. The other executives in the room watched this dynamic play out with varying degrees of discomfort, some clearly torn between loyalty to the man who had built the company and fear of the man who might soon inherit it. Jennifer Walsh, the head of human resources, shifted nervously in her seat. She'd been with the company for 12 years, and had watched David grow from a rebellious teenager visiting the office during summer breaks to the powerful executive he was today. Her relationship with him was complicated, to say the least. She'd fielded numerous complaints about his management style, his tendency to take credit for others' work, and his apparent inability to accept criticism of any kind. Tom Rodriguez, the director of client relations, sat across from me, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. He'd been the one to first bring certain irregularities to my attention, whispering concerns during coffee breaks about discrepancies in project budgets and questions about expense reports that never seemed to get satisfactory answers. Tom had 20 years of experience in the industry and had never seen anything quite like what we'd uncovered. The meeting began with routine updates about quarterly performance, client satisfaction scores, and upcoming project deadlines. The usual corporate theater played out with PowerPoint presentations and carefully crafted talking points. But everyone in that room knew we were building up to something bigger. The elephant in the room was the audit report I'd been commissioned to prepare, the one that was supposed to address some concerning financial irregularities that had been brought to the company's attention by several department heads. Marcus cleared his throat and looked directly at me. "Sarah, I believe you have findings to share with the group regarding the operational audit you've been conducting." His voice was steady, but I caught the slight emphasis on the word findings, as if he was bracing himself for what was about to come. I stood up, my heart pounding against my ribcage. 7 years of experience had taught me how to present difficult findings with professionalism and tact, but this felt different. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or procedural violations. This was about the future of a company that employed over 300 people, about the integrity of systems that clients trusted with millions of dollars, and about holding people accountable regardless of their last name. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," I began, opening my portfolio and extracting the bound report that represented months of careful investigation. Over the past quarter, I've conducted a comprehensive review of our operational procedures, expense management, and project allocation systems. What I've discovered requires immediate attention and corrective action. The room fell completely silent except for the continued howling of the November wind outside. David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest in a posture that radiated defiance before he'd even heard what I had to say. This body language wasn't lost on anyone in the room, and I could see several executives exchanging meaningful glances. I took a deep breath and continued. The audit revealed systematic irregularities in expense reporting within the operations department, specifically related to project budgets overseen by the Vice President's office. Over a 6-month period, there were 47 instances of expenses being charged to client accounts without proper authorization, totaling approximately $230,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his knuckles white with tension. Jennifer Walsh's face had gone pale, and she was frantically taking notes, probably already thinking about the legal implications of what I just revealed. Tom Rodriguez nodded grimly, confirming with his expression that this matched what he'd suspected. But David's reaction was the most telling of all. Instead of surprise, shock, or even defensive questions about the methodology of my investigation, his face flushed red with anger. His jaw tightened, and I could see the vein in his temple beginning to throb. This wasn't the reaction of someone hearing surprising news for the first time. This was the reaction of someone who had been caught. "I'd like to review the specifics," I continued, opening to the first page of detailed findings. The pattern shows consistent overbilling for travel expenses, meals that exceeded client-approved limits, and equipment purchases that were charged to active projects but never delivered to client sites. Additionally, there were multiple instances of personal expenses being processed through corporate accounts and then buried in larger project budgets where they were less likely to be noticed. Marcus's face had grown increasingly grave as I spoke. This was a man who had built his reputation on integrity and transparency. Harrison and Associates had won numerous industry awards for ethical business practices, and Marcus took personal pride in the company's spotless record with clients and regulatory bodies. What I was describing threatened everything he had worked to build over the past 30 years. "These are serious allegations, Sarah," Marcus said carefully, his voice controlled but strained. "Do you have documentation to support these findings?" "Yes, sir. Every finding in this report is backed by original receipts, email correspondence, and financial records. I've also included a detailed timeline showing when each irregularity occurred and which approval processes were circumvented." I handed him a copy of the report, watching as he immediately began flipping through the pages, his expression growing more concerned with each piece of evidence. That's when David exploded. "This is absolutely ridiculous," he said, his voice rising to a level that was completely inappropriate for a professional meeting. "I don't know what kind of witch hunt this is supposed to be, but I'm not going to sit here and listen to baseless accusations from someone who clearly doesn't understand how executive operations work." The room erupted in uncomfortable tension. Several executives shifted in their seats, clearly taken aback by David's aggressive response. This wasn't how a professional handles criticism or investigation findings. This was how a cornered animal lashes out when threatened. Jennifer Walsh looked mortified, probably already calculating the HR nightmare that was unfolding before her eyes. Tom Rodriguez stared at David with undisguised disgust, his worst suspicions about the young executive apparently being confirmed in real time. But Marcus remained calm, though I could see the disappointment and embarrassment warring in his expression. "David, let's hear the complete presentation before we respond. Sarah has clearly put considerable effort into this investigation." David wasn't having it. He stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall behind him with a loud thud. "No, Dad. This is exactly the kind of micromanaging bureaucracy that's holding this company back. We need to be nimble, we need to be flexible, and we can't have people like Sarah second-guessing every executive decision with her little spreadsheets and her petty procedural concerns. The dismissive way he said people like Sarah sent a chill through the room. It was loaded with implications about gender, about authority, about who deserved respect in this organization. I felt my own anger rising, but I forced myself to maintain professional composure. "Mr. Harrison," I said, addressing David directly but keeping my voice level and professional. "These aren't procedural concerns. These are potential violations of federal regulations governing client billing practices. If these irregularities are discovered during a regulatory audit or investigation, the company could face serious penalties, not to mention the damage to our reputation with clients." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was a cold, bitter sound that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "You're being dramatic, Sarah. This is exactly why women shouldn't be in positions where they have to make tough business decisions. You get emotional, you blow things out of proportion, and you create problems where none exist." The sexist comment hung in the air like poison gas. I heard Jennifer Walsh gasp audibly, and I saw Tom Rodriguez's hands clench into fists. Even Marcus looked stunned by his son's words, his face flushing with what appeared to be deep embarrassment and anger. But I wasn't finished. I'd spent too many years building my reputation in this industry, too many nights working late to prove myself, too many moments swallowing my pride when men like David dismissed my expertise, to back down now. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrison," I continued, my voice steady despite the fury burning in my chest. "My gender has nothing to do with my ability to identify financial irregularities. What we're discussing here are documented violations of company policy and potentially federal law. These findings aren't emotional responses. They're factual conclusions based on extensive evidence." David's face grew even redder. He pointed his finger at me across the table, his voice rising to just below a shout. "I don't care what your little investigation claims to have found. As Vice President of Operations, I make the decisions about how this department runs, and I don't need approval from you or anyone else for every minor expense decision. If you don't like how I run my department, maybe you should consider whether you're the right fit for this company." The threat was clear to everyone in the room. David was using his position and his relationship with Marcus to try to intimidate me into backing down. He was betting that his status as the boss's son would protect him from consequences and that I would fold under pressure rather than risk my career. He was wrong. Marcus finally spoke, and his voice carried the authority of 3 decades of leadership. "David, sit down. Right now." The command was sharp and final, the voice of a father who had reached the end of his patience with a child's behavior. But David was too far gone to recognize the warning signs. Instead of sitting down, he turned his anger toward his father. "Don't take her side on this, Dad. This is exactly what I'm talking about. We can't run a business by committee, and we can't let every employee with a calculator think they can question executive decisions." The room watched in horrified fascination as the family drama played out in front of them. This was clearly a dynamic that had been building for years, with David growing increasingly entitled and Marcus growing increasingly frustrated with his son's inability to accept responsibility or show respect for others. Marcus stood up slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried more authority than all of David's shouting combined. "David, sit down. Now." Finally recognizing that he had pushed too far, David reluctantly took his seat, but the sullen expression on his face made it clear that he wasn't backing down from his position. He slumped in his chair like a petulant teenager who had been scolded, his arms crossed and his jaw set in defiant anger. Marcus turned to me, and I could see him struggling to maintain his professional composure in front of the entire executive team. "Sarah, please continue with your presentation. I want to hear all of your findings." For the next 20 minutes, I walked through the detailed evidence I had compiled. Each page of the report told a story of systematic abuse of authority, of company resources being treated as personal funds, and of a management style that prioritized personal benefit over corporate responsibility. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I showed them receipts for meals at five-star restaurants charged to client accounts when those clients had explicitly approved only modest dining budgets. I presented documentation of first-class flights being charged to projects when the client agreements specified economy travel. I revealed equipment purchases that were billed to active projects but delivered to addresses that had nothing to do with client work. Most damning of all, I had discovered a pattern of personal expenses being processed through the corporate system. Gym memberships, luxury car payments, even what appeared to be payments for a weekend vacation rental. All buried in the operational budgets of large projects where they were unlikely to be noticed during routine reviews. The financial impact was significant, but the ethical implications were catastrophic. Harrison and Associates had built its reputation on trust and transparency. Clients paid premium rates because they believed they were getting honest, ethical service. What David had been doing threatened to destroy 30 years of carefully cultivated trust and reputation. As I presented each piece of evidence, I watched the faces around the table. Marcus looked increasingly grave, his hands shaking slightly as he reviewed the documentation. Jennifer Walsh was taking furious notes, probably already planning the damage control strategy that would be needed. Tom Rodriguez looked vindicated but sad, clearly taking no pleasure in being proven right about his suspicions. But David's reaction was what concerned me most. Instead of showing remorse, embarrassment, or even healthy concern about the implications of what I was revealing, he looked increasingly angry. His face had gone from red to almost purple, and I could see him grinding his teeth as I walked through each finding. When I finished my presentation, the room fell into complete silence. The only sounds were the wind outside and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Everyone was waiting to see how Marcus would respond to the devastating evidence against his son. Marcus set down the report and looked around the room at each executive in turn. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with disappointment and exhaustion. I want to thank Sarah for her thorough and professional work on this investigation. These findings are deeply concerning and require immediate action. He paused, seeming to gather his strength for what came next. Effective immediately, all expense approvals from the operations department will require secondary authorization from either myself or the CFO. Additionally, we'll be implementing enhanced monitoring procedures for all project-related expenses. It was a reasonable and necessary response to the evidence I had presented, but it clearly wasn't what David wanted to hear. He exploded again, even more dramatically than before. "This is unacceptable," he shouted, jumping to his feet again. "You're treating me like a criminal based on the paranoid fantasies of someone who clearly has an agenda against me. I will not be micromanaged like some entry-level employee, and I will not tolerate this kind of public humiliation." Marcus's patience finally snapped completely. "David, you will lower your voice, and you will show respect for your colleagues in this room. Sarah has done her job with professionalism and integrity, something you seem incapable of recognizing or appreciating." The father-son confrontation was painful to witness. 30 years of building a business, of trying to instill values and integrity in a son who seemed determined to reject both. Marcus looked like he had aged a decade in the past hour, the weight of what he was learning about his son's behavior clearly crushing his spirit. David's response was to double down on his defiance. "If this is how you want to run the company, Dad, maybe it's time for you to step aside and let someone with vision take over. I'm tired of being held back by outdated policies and excessive oversight." The audacity of the statement left everyone speechless. Here was a young man who had just been presented with overwhelming evidence of his own misconduct, and his response was to suggest that his father should retire and hand over control of the company to him. Marcus stared at his son for a long moment, and I could see something break inside him. The realization that all his efforts to mentor and guide David had failed, that the son he had adopted and raised and tried to prepare for leadership was fundamentally lacking in the character necessary to lead others. "This meeting is adjourned," Marcus said quietly. "David, I want to see you in my office immediately. Everyone else, please return to your regular duties. Sarah, thank you for your work on this investigation. Please prepare a detailed action plan for addressing these issues, and we'll schedule a follow-up meeting for next week." As the executives began filing out of the conference room, David turned to me one last time. His voice was low enough that only I could hear, but his words were filled with venom. This isn't over, Sarah. You have no idea who you're messing with. I'll make sure you regret trying to destroy my reputation. It was a threat, plain and simple. Not subtle or veiled, but a direct promise of retaliation for doing my job and uncovering his misconduct. Several people were still in earshot, including Jennifer Walsh, who had clearly heard every word and was frantically writing in her notepad. That evening, I sat in my small apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, staring at my laptop screen and wrestling with the most difficult professional decision of my career. The October wind was howling outside, rattling my windows and matching the storm of thoughts churning in my mind. I had done everything right, followed every protocol, presented factual evidence in a professional manner. But I knew that David's threat wasn't empty. I had seen what happened to employees who crossed him in the past. Subtle campaigns of harassment, suddenly impossible performance expectations, being excluded from important meetings and decisions until they eventually left the company. David had the power to make my professional life miserable, and based on his reaction in the meeting, I had no doubt that he would use that power. But I also knew something else. I knew that Marcus Harrison was a man of integrity who deserved to know the full extent of what his son was doing to the company he had spent his life building. The evidence I had presented in the meeting was damning, but it wasn't complete. There were additional findings that I hadn't included in the formal report, things that were even more serious and personal. During my investigation, I had discovered that David wasn't just misusing company funds for personal expenses. He was also using his position to manipulate and intimidate other employees, particularly women in the company. I had documentation of inappropriate comments, unwelcome advances, and what appeared to be a pattern of creating hostile work environments for anyone who questioned his authority or refused his advances. Jennifer Walsh in HR had been trying to address these issues quietly, but David's position as the boss's son made it nearly impossible for her to take formal action. Complaints were filed and then mysteriously disappeared from employee files. Witnesses were transferred to different departments or found reasons to leave the company entirely. It was a systematic abuse of power that went far beyond financial misconduct. I also knew that David had been lying to his father about the company's operational efficiency. Marcus believed that his son was implementing innovative management strategies that were improving productivity and profitability. In reality, David was taking credit for improvements that were actually the result of other people's work while covering up problems and inefficiencies that were getting worse under his leadership. The department turnover rate under David's management was 3 times higher than any other department in the company, but he had been reporting to Marcus that people were leaving for better opportunities elsewhere, not because of his toxic leadership style. Key clients had begun asking specifically not to work with David's team, but he had convinced his father that this was due to personality conflicts rather than legitimate concerns about his competence and professionalism. As I sat there contemplating my options, I realized that my choice wasn't really about protecting my own career anymore. It was about whether I was willing to be complicit in allowing David to continue damaging the company and hurting other employees. It was about whether the values that Marcus had tried to instill in his organization meant anything, or whether nepotism and family loyalty trumped integrity and accountability. I opened my laptop and began typing an email that I knew would change everything. The subject line was simple: complete audit findings, confidential review requested. I attached not only the formal report I had presented to the executive team, but also the additional documentation I had compiled about David's broader pattern of misconduct and abuse of authority. In the body of the email, I wrote, "Mr. Harrison, I believe you deserve to see the complete findings from my investigation. While I presented the financial irregularities in today's meeting, there are additional concerns that I felt required your private attention before any formal action is taken. The attached documentation speaks for itself, but I want you to know that this decision to share these findings comes from my commitment to the values and integrity that you have worked so hard to establish at Harrison and Associates. I remain available to discuss these findings at your convenience." I hesitated for a moment before hitting send, knowing that this action would likely seal my fate at the company regardless of how Marcus responded. David would never forgive me for going directly to his father with additional evidence of his misconduct. Even if Marcus took appropriate action, David would find ways to make my continued employment unbearable. But sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting personal consequences. I had watched too many good people leave the company because of David's behavior. I had seen too many clients expressing concerns about the quality of service they were receiving. I had witnessed too many instances of David taking credit for others' work while deflecting blame for his own failures. Marcus Harrison deserved to know the truth about what his son was doing to the company he had built from nothing. The employees deserved leadership that respected their contributions and treated them with dignity. The clients deserved honest, competent service that justified the premium rates they were paying. I clicked send and immediately felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I had finally done what I knew was right, and terror about what would happen when David discovered what I had done. There would be no way to hide the fact that I had sent the complete findings directly to Marcus. David would know that his father had seen evidence of his misconduct that went far beyond what had been discussed in the executive meeting. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Chicago weather that matches difficult moods perfectly. I arrived at the office early, before most of the other employees, hoping to have some quiet time to prepare for what I suspected would be a challenging day. The hallways were empty except for the security guard and the cleaning crew finishing their overnight shift. My office was located on the 38th floor, 4 floors below the executive suites where Marcus and David had their offices. It was a corner office with windows facing both the lake and the city skyline, a perk that reflected my 7 years of service and my position as senior auditor. On normal days, I loved watching the sunrise paint the water gold and pink while I reviewed reports and prepared for meetings. But this morning, I barely noticed the view. I was too focused on my computer screen, watching my email inbox for any sign of Marcus's response to what I had sent him the night before. I had no idea how long it would take him to review the additional documentation, or how he would react to learning the full scope of his son's misconduct. At exactly 8:30, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus's direct line, and my heart immediately began racing. I took a deep breath and answered with as much professional composure as I could manage. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Sarah, I need to see you in my office immediately. Come alone, and don't discuss this with anyone else." His voice was strained, and I could hear exhaustion and stress in every word. It was clear that he had spent the night reviewing the evidence I had sent him. "I'll be right up, sir." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like it took forever, even though it was only a few minutes. I tried to prepare myself for various scenarios, from Marcus thanking me for bringing the additional information to his attention, to him being angry about my decision to bypass normal reporting channels. I had no idea which reaction to expect, but I knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine the rest of my career at Harrison and Associates. Marcus's secretary wasn't at her desk yet, so I knocked directly on his office door. His voice called for me to enter, and I stepped into the spacious corner office that had been his domain for the past 15 years. The walls were lined with awards, client appreciation plaques, and photos from various industry conferences and company events. But what struck me immediately was how Marcus looked. He appeared to have aged years since the meeting the day before. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled. His tie was loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. The additional documentation I had provided had clearly shaken him to his core. He gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then sat down heavily in his own chair. For a long moment, he just stared at the papers spread across his desk, and I could see my report among them, marked with yellow highlights and handwritten notes in the margins. When he finally looked up at me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude, disappointment, and profound sadness. "Sarah, I want to thank you for bringing this information to my attention. I know it couldn't have been an easy decision to make." "It wasn't, sir. But I felt you had the right to know the full scope of what my investigation had uncovered." He nodded slowly, then picked up one of the documents from my supplementary report. "These allegations about harassment and workplace intimidation. Do you have corroborating evidence from the employees involved?" "Yes, sir. I spoke with 7 current employees who were willing to provide detailed accounts of their experiences. I also have documentation from HR files that shows a pattern of complaints that were filed but never properly investigated or resolved. Marcus closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with the implications of what I was telling him. And the clients who have requested not to work with David's team? 3 major clients over the past 8 months. In each case, the client liaison contacted me directly to express concerns about project management and communication issues. They were diplomatic about it, but their feedback made it clear that they were dissatisfied with the service they were receiving from the operations department. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. Marcus was clearly grappling with the reality that his son was not just financially irresponsible, but was also actively damaging relationships with employees and clients. The company he had spent 3 decades building was being undermined by the person he had hoped would eventually take over leadership. "What would you recommend as next steps?" he asked finally. I had spent the entire night thinking about this question, knowing that my answer could determine not only David's future with the company, but also the future of Harrison and Associates itself. "Sir, I believe this situation requires immediate and decisive action. The financial irregularities need to be addressed through formal disciplinary procedures, including restitution of misappropriated funds. The harassment allegations need to be investigated by an external firm to ensure objectivity and protect the company from potential legal liability." Marcus nodded grimly. "And David's position with the company?" This was the most difficult part of my recommendation, but I knew I had to be honest. "Mr. Harrison, based on the evidence I've compiled, I don't believe David can continue in a leadership role at Harrison and Associates. The pattern of misconduct is too extensive, and his reaction to being held accountable suggests that he's unlikely to accept the level of oversight and behavioral change that would be necessary." The words hung in the air between us, and I could see Marcus struggling with the reality of what I was telling him. This wasn't just about firing an incompetent employee. This was about acknowledging that the son he had raised and mentored was fundamentally unsuited for the leadership role he had been preparing him for. "I've been hoping that he would mature, that he would grow into the role and develop the character necessary for leadership," Marcus said quietly. "I realize now that I've been making excuses for behavior that I would never tolerate from any other employee. Sir, if I may, the values that you've established at this company, the reputation for integrity and excellence that you've built, these things are more important than any individual person, including family members. The employees look to you for leadership that's consistent and fair. The clients trust you to provide service that meets your stated standards." Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline where other business leaders were probably dealing with their own difficult decisions. When he turned back to me, I could see that he had reached a conclusion. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you to prepare a comprehensive report detailing all of your findings, including the supplementary information you shared with me last night. I want everything documented formally so that we can address this situation properly. I'll also be engaging an external consultant to conduct an independent review of our HR procedures and workplace culture." "And David?" I asked carefully. "David will be suspended from his duties immediately, pending the completion of the formal investigation. Depending on the findings of that investigation, his employment with the company will be terminated." It was the right decision, but I could see how much it was costing Marcus to make it. This was his son, someone he had hoped would carry on his legacy. Instead, he was having to choose between family loyalty and the integrity of the company he had spent his life building. "Sir, I want you to know that I take no pleasure in any of this. I've always respected what you've built here, and I know how difficult this must be for you personally." Marcus returned to his chair and looked at me with an expression that mixed appreciation with exhaustion. "Sarah, you've done exactly what I would expect from someone with your integrity and professionalism. This company survives and thrives because we have people like you who are willing to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, as we discussed the practical details of implementing the investigation and managing the transition of David's responsibilities to other executives. Marcus was thorough and professional, but I could see the emotional toll that the situation was taking on him. As I prepared to leave his office, Marcus stopped me with one final comment. "Sarah, I want you to know that your job security is not in question. I'm aware that David made threats against you yesterday, and I want to assure you that such behavior will not be tolerated. You've acted with courage and integrity, and that will be recognized and protected. I left Marcus's office with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the right action was being taken, but sadness for what this meant for a family and a company that had been struggling with these issues for far too long. The aftermath of that conversation unfolded over the following weeks in ways that were both predictable and surprising. David's suspension was announced to the executive team as a temporary measure pending an administrative review. But word spread quickly through the company grapevine that something significant was happening in the upper levels of management. David's reaction to his suspension was everything I had expected and worse. He blamed me entirely for his situation, convinced that I had orchestrated some kind of conspiracy against him. He sent me several angry emails before his company access was revoked, and he made multiple attempts to contact other executives to rally support for his position. But the external investigation that Marcus commissioned uncovered even more problems than my audit had revealed. The independent consultants found evidence of additional financial irregularities, more instances of harassment and intimidation, and a pattern of operational failures that David had been covering up by manipulating reports and deflecting blame onto subordinates. Most shocking of all, they discovered that David had been in preliminary discussions with a competing firm about potentially taking key clients and employees with him if he ever decided to leave Harrison and Associates. It was a level of betrayal that went beyond mere incompetence or even misconduct. It was active disloyalty to the company that had given him every opportunity to succeed. When the investigation was completed 6 weeks later, Marcus made the difficult but necessary decision to terminate David's employment. The decision was presented to the board of directors as a routine personnel matter, but everyone who had been involved in the process understood the significance of what had transpired. David's departure was handled as quietly as possible to minimize damage to the company's reputation, but the internal impact was immediate and positive. Employee morale improved dramatically once word spread that accountability applied to everyone, regardless of their family connections. Several key employees who had been considering leaving the company decided to stay. Client relationships that had been strained began to improve as more competent leadership took over the operations department. For me personally, the experience was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. Standing up to David and providing Marcus with the complete truth about his son's behavior had required a level of courage and professional integrity that I wasn't sure I possessed before it was tested. The experience taught me that doing the right thing sometimes requires accepting significant personal risk, but that the alternative, being complicit in misconduct and abuse, is ultimately more damaging to both personal and professional integrity. Marcus never explicitly thanked me for my role in exposing David's behavior, but his actions spoke louder than words. Over the following months, I was given increased responsibilities, included in higher-level strategic discussions, and eventually promoted to Director of Financial Operations, taking over many of the duties that had previously been David's responsibility. The company culture changed as well, becoming more open and transparent. Marcus implemented new policies that encouraged employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation, and he established regular reviews of management practices to ensure that power wasn't being abused at any level of the organization. Looking back on that difficult period, I realized that the situation could have played out very differently if I had chosen to stay silent about the additional evidence I had uncovered. David could have continued his pattern of misconduct and abuse, gradually destroying the company culture that Marcus had worked so hard to establish. Key employees would have continued leaving, client relationships would have deteriorated further, and the company's reputation for integrity and excellence would have been permanently damaged. The decision to send that email to Marcus was one of the most difficult professional decisions I've ever made, but it was also one of the most important. It demonstrated that sometimes doing the right thing requires bypassing normal channels and taking personal risks to ensure that truth and accountability prevail over family politics and corporate hierarchy. The story of David Harrison serves as a reminder that nepotism and privilege can create dangerous blind spots in organizational leadership. When family relationships interfere with objective evaluation of performance and behavior, the entire organization suffers. It takes courage from employees at all levels to speak up when they witness misconduct, But it also takes courage from leadership to listen to difficult truths and take appropriate action, even when it means making personally painful decisions. Today, Harrison and Associates continues to thrive as one of Chicago's premier consulting firms. The company's reputation for integrity and excellence has not only survived the David Harrison incident, but has actually been strengthened by the way Marcus handled the situation. Clients and employees alike recognize that the company's stated values are more than just marketing slogans. They are principles that guide actual decision-making at every level of the organization. As for David, he eventually found a position with a smaller firm where his family connections weren't known, but according to industry contacts, he lasted less than 18 months before being quietly let go for similar issues. Some people never learn that success requires more than just privilege and entitlement. It requires character, integrity, and the ability to treat others with respect and dignity. The experience taught me that workplace justice isn't always immediate or obvious, but it does exist when people are willing to stand up for what's right. Marcus Harrison could have chosen to protect his son at the expense of his company and employees, but he chose instead to uphold the values that had made his business successful. That decision preserved not only the company's integrity but also the jobs and careers of hundreds of employees who deserved leadership they could respect and trust. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against people who seem untouchable because of their position or connections. But every workplace has mechanisms for accountability, and every organization has people in leadership positions who understand that long-term success depends on maintaining standards that apply to everyone equally. The key is finding the courage to document problems carefully, present evidence professionally, and trust that good leaders will make the right decisions when they have access to complete and accurate information. It's not always easy, and it doesn't always work out perfectly, but the alternative is accepting a workplace culture where power can be abused without consequences. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Do your homework, document everything, present your findings professionally, and trust in the power of truth to ultimately prevail. Don't let fear of retaliation prevent you from speaking up when you witness misconduct or abuse of power. The people who built successful organizations understand that their reputation and long-term viability depend on maintaining standards of integrity and accountability. And remember that you're not just standing up for yourself when you report misconduct. You're standing up for every employee who has been mistreated, every client who has been taken advantage of, and every person who believes that workplaces should be governed by merit and integrity rather than privilege and politics. The morning after David's termination was officially announced, I arrived at the office to find a handwritten note on my desk from Marcus. It was brief but meaningful. Thank you for helping me remember what this company stands for. Your courage and integrity have made all the difference. It was signed simply MH. That note still sits framed on my desk today, not as a trophy or a reminder of victory, but as a reminder of the responsibility that comes with positions of trust and authority. Sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrifice, but it's always worth it when the alternative is allowing corruption and abuse to flourish unchecked. The winds outside my office window continue to blow off Lake Michigan, bringing new seasons and new challenges. But I face them now with the confidence that comes from knowing I can stand up for what's right when it matters most. And in a world where workplace integrity sometimes seems like a quaint notion from the past, that confidence makes all the difference. Harrison and Associates continues to grow and prosper, built on the foundation of values that proved stronger than family loyalty when tested. The company culture now reflects the kind of workplace that Marcus always intended to create, where success is measured by contribution and character rather than connections and politics. And every day, that culture attracts talented people who want to work for an organization that stands for something meaningful. The story of what happened in that conference room on a cold November morning serves as a reminder that accountability and integrity aren't just nice ideas to put in company mission statements. They're practical necessities for any organization that wants to build lasting success based on trust, respect, and genuine excellence. When those values are tested, the response determines not just the fate of individuals involved, but the character and future of the entire organization. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with carefully documented evidence presented professionally to people who have the authority and integrity to act on the truth. The real victory isn't in defeating an opponent, but in preserving the values and standards that make organizations worth being part of in the first place.